I grew up in an extremely small rural town in Florida on a farm. The population of our town was less than 1,000 people. The closest city, Gainesville, Florida, was about an hour away. The nights were pitch black dark because there were no street lights or light pollution, like in the city, except for the light of a million stars. My great-grandfather passed away when I was about 8 years old, leaving my granny heartbroken. We lived a field away from my great-grandmother, who was about 75 at the time. Unfortunately, Granny had already started getting early Alzheimer's and sometimes didn't act like herself. The family, besides me, decided that it would be best if I moved in with her so that she didn't have to be alone in the evenings and at night. Granny lived in an old farmhouse that she had helped build by hand with my granddaddy in the 1930s. The house was constructed of wood with a tin roof. We did have electricity at this time, but no air conditioner or telephone. The front door was wood, and the top half of the door was a glass window pane with a small decorative curtain across the very top, the kind you might see on a kitchen window. Needless to say, anyone could see inside the house as clearly as we could see them. The door lock was the original one made by my granddaddy. It wasn't really a lock at all. It was a piece of wood nailed to the frame that you turned horizontally when you closed the door, meant to keep someone from pushing the door open. I slept in the room with my granny. Our bedroom was at the very front of the house, right next to the front door, and my bed was pushed directly up to the window that looked out over the front porch and yard. I always felt safe because my family and aunts and uncles lived in the adjacent farms all around us. In 1990, that all changed. I was 10 years old by now. Granny was getting more forgetful, sometimes wandering around the house at night. In the nearby city, something awful had occurred. A man had broken into apartments of several college students in Gainesville, murdered them, and done horrible things to their bodies. There were no suspects. The police called him the Gainesville Ripper. Rumors spread through the community like wildfire. Some said the killer was dressing up like a cable man or electric man to get people to let him in their door. Fear and anxiety grew daily. As the police had no leads, my dad decided it was time to teach me how to use our family weapon, just in case. Dad took me out in the woods, and I practiced. That night, I fell asleep with the weapon beside the head of my bed, with clear instructions to not open the door for anyone we didn't know. As a 10-year-old, I felt like this was a pretty big responsibility, and my anxiety kept me from sleeping much those next few nights. They reassured me that I would never have to use the weapon, but better to be safe than sorry. Until the next night, which was the most terrifying night of my life. Up until this point, I was laying in bed looking at the digital clock on Granny's dresser, 3:05 a.m., in bright red digits. Granny had gotten up to wander around the kitchen. She did this often, and I just let her do what she thought she needed to do. I heard a tap on the front door window pane. I listened intently, and then silence. Suddenly, the porch light flipped on, illuminating through my little window. What was Granny doing? I scurried out of bed to the front door just in time to reach for Granny's hand, as she was trying to turn the piece of wood keeping the door locked. At the same time, I looked out the window, my eyes meeting the eyes of a strange man standing there. The porch light was behind him, and I couldn't see his face very well, but his hair was long and unkempt. I did not know him. He jiggled the handle and pushed hard on the door with all his weight. I was terrified, and I excitedly screamed at Granny, asking what she was doing. She told me Granddaddy was at the door. She sometimes thought Granddaddy was still alive. There was no convincing her it wasn't him. With the man pushing furiously against the door, I had to drag Granny with both hands into the bedroom, so I could reach the weapon without giving her a chance to open the door. I grabbed the weapon and ran into the living room, aiming directly at the front door, my finger on the trigger. The stranger was gone. I had no telephone to call for help. We were trapped. I sat in the recliner by the front door, staring out into the darkness beyond the porch light, with weapon in hand for the rest of the night. Unable to swallow, Shaking so hard I could barely aim the weapon, I waited for the man to return, to try one of the flimsy windows or the back door. Every moving shadow, distant dog bark, bump in the night, or snap of a twig had my heart racing and blood rushing through my ears. The wind would blow and make the screen door creak open and fall shut with a bang. It was torture. My arms ached from holding the weapon. My nightgown was soaked with sweat, and I was on the verge of bursting into soul-wrenching sobs. But I had a job to do, guarding us from the Ripper. Oblivious, Granny tottered around the kitchen getting ready to make breakfast, because Grandaddy would be wanting his coffee soon. I didn't argue or care what she did as long as she stayed away from that front door. I never saw another glimpse of the stranger, but I felt like he was out there, watching us. After staying wide awake all night, terrified, holding vigil, I made sure Granny was back to sleep, slipped out the back door, and ran straight across the hayfields home to Mom and Dad for help once the sun came up in the morning. Police eventually caught the Gainesville Ripper, and it was not the same man I saw at our front door that night. My family hired an elderly lady to stay with Granny, and I moved home permanently. To this day, I don't know who was at the door on that pitch-black night, but I still panic, looking out of windows at night into the darkness. I would like to start by saying that all the names in this story have been changed. Last year, in 2021, I was living in a townhouse in New Mexico with my twin sister, we'll call her Carrie, and our two childhood best friends, Robbie and Izzy. The time in that house was full of your typical young adult ups and downs, but amplified by the turmoil of the pandemic. That house was full of good, bad, and ugly times, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. However, the last few months were absolutely terrible before I ended up leaving the state. Let me start with a little backstory. Carrie had been in a relationship with a man who we will call Jay. Jay and Carrie had a very unhealthy relationship, which ended with him being kicked out of our house after an altercation between him and Carrie. Police were called, and we thought that would be the end of it. Let's just say, he didn't take being thrown out of the house and dumped too well. One day, on the off chance that I had a day off from work, I was in the kitchen most of the day doing some deep cleaning and self-care. While I was able to do the first part with ease, I could not for the life of me shake the feeling of being watched. I have struggled with anxiety symptoms due to PTSD, so I wrote this off as me just having a bad day. That was until Robbie came home, throwing the door open and shouting, "Tell me why I saw Jay circling our block." I was in shock. I ran to the window looking over our street, and sure enough, Jay's car was speeding off. We told Carrie about it as soon as she got home from work that day, and she then revealed to myself, Robbie, and Izzy that Jay had been stalking her. I was not surprised given the details of this situation, as Carrie then told us about this next situation, which shook me to my core. One night, I want to say this story was about 2 weeks prior to him circling the block. Jay had been watching Carrie from afar while she went out with friends. Carrie must have forgot to lock the door when she came home. She says she woke up from a deep sleep and could have sworn that she saw someone standing over her bed. She said she didn't want to tell us right away because she had first assumed that she was dreaming or even having an episode of sleep paralysis. She would later receive a message from Jay scolding her for not talking to him when he came to the house the other night. That other night in question being the same night Carrie had come home. I started locking the doors even when everyone was home after Carrie told me that story. He was in the house while we were all sleeping sound in our beds, unaware that someone who we all didn't want anywhere near us was just sulking in the corner of my sister's bedroom. Watching over her, he could have done anything, but he chose to just watch her. That was deeply unsettling for all of us. Now I had already made the decision that once my lease was over, I was going to be moving in with my partner in a different state. At this point, we had all been packing up our things and preparing to move, go our separate ways. For more context, the landlord had installed a security system. Nothing high-tech by any means, But any time a door or window was open, the alarm would say in a robotic monotone voice, "Side door open" or "Back office window closed." Things like that. One night I was home alone. Carrie was at dinner with Robbie and Robbie's mom, and I had no idea where Izzy was until this series of events happened. I was in my bedroom when suddenly I heard what sounded like tapping on my window. I figured it was the branches tapping like they usually did when there was even a small gust of wind, but the tapping was constant, timed almost. I still shrugged it off again, trying not to make myself anxious while I was alone in the house. It was then that I heard the security system go off. Back sliding door open from the other room. Weird. We all usually come in through the side door when the kitchen and living room meet, as our front door was next to impossible to open from the outside. I brushed it off, thinking maybe Carrie and Robbie had forgotten their keys and just came in through the back door. I called out from my bedroom, "Carrie, Roddy, how was dinner?" No response. As soon as the words left my mouth, the silence was deafening. I walked out to the hallways where all of the bedrooms led and called out again, "Carrie, Roddy, Izzy?" Again, nothing. I'm getting a bit freaked out now, but I'm thinking that they didn't hear me. But that silence. I will never in my life forget the silence that rang through that house as I inched closer to the living room. As I am finally standing in the living room, the only sounds I had heard in the span of a few minutes was my own heart beating out of my chest, my footsteps, and the AC kicking on. I finally reached the living room, and I had checked Find My Friends. To my horror, Carrie and Robbie were still at the restaurant with Robbie's mom. Izzy's phone had broken during this time too, so I had no clue where she was still. Knowing what I know at that moment, I called out one last time, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the corner and go into the kitchen. "Izzy, are you home?" Silence again. I figured maybe I was just hearing things at that point. Then I heard it. Came a hushed whisper from the kitchen, followed by the most hurried footsteps behind me, going out the back door. I froze. Who was that? It all made sense at that point. The tapping on the window, the door opening with no noise from whoever opened it, and now this. I knew at that moment that I was not alone. Something came over me, and I snapped out of this frozen reaction. "You better get out of my house," I screamed at the top of my lungs. I grabbed the baseball bat that I kept in the hall closet and started shouting that same sentence in 10 different ways, opening all the doors and switching on all the lights, making sure that whoever this was had left. I finally made it to the kitchen and found out the sliding glass door was left wide open by whoever came into it. As soon as the adrenaline had worn off, the shock then set in. I booked it out of the house, locking the doors before throwing open my car door and ripping out the driveway without putting on my seatbelt. I called all my roommates, whose phones still worked. I later found out that Izzy had actually left town for the weekend, and I had missed that conversation, so I know whoever was in the house was not my sister or either of my other 2 roommates. Robbie called the police as soon as we got off the phone. Of course, there wasn't much they could do because nothing was stolen, and I didn't see who was in my home uninvited. I drove to my coworker's house, and I broke down telling her what happened, and I waited for her to update me on what she and Carrie were going to do. They opted to stay at the hotel with Robbie's mom that night. I don't know who it was that broke into my house that night. Was it Jay? Some drunk college kid who stumbled into our yard thinking it was their place. Someone with more sinister intentions who got caught at the right time. I am not sure. I think that is what keeps me up sometimes when I think too deeply about that night. I know it wasn't an anxiety-induced thing. I saw the door and I heard the whisper of the footsteps hurrying out the same door they came in. I am just happy that I live with my partner in a different state now, in a relatively safe neighborhood. But even that, some nights, is not enough to allow me to feel safe when I am home alone. I was around 17 when this incident happened. I was in junior college and had rented out a tiny apartment in a standalone building. This building was right behind a construction site, meaning that not many people were around this place. especially in the night. For context, I was living with another girl, let's call her Nancy, who was completing her education too. One day, I had to go attend a friend's birthday party. There were about 12 people that attended the party that evening. I didn't expect it to be late by the time I'd get back home, so I did not see it as a problem that my friend wouldn't be able to accommodate me in case something were to go wrong. However, things did not go as I had planned. Being young and stupid, I gave in to my friend's request to stay at the party until late that night. This meant that I would be on my own when I was to go back home, since there simply was no space for me in my friend's tiny apartment, especially not when she had 5 more people staying over that night. To avoid going back alone, I brought 2 of my companions for a sleepover, Sandra and Katja. Our Uber dropped us off in front of the construction site. Since that night, the conditions were less than ideal to drive to the building I lived in. The workers had just been careless and left piles of concrete in the way. We were left with no choice but to cross the construction site to get home. I remember how Sandra kept saying that she was a little apprehensive and she should have taken her pepper spray along with her. I tried to act brave, but honestly was a little scared. Katja, on the other hand, was carefree, and we followed her lead. We were walking through the construction site when we saw something that took us aback. We saw a bizarre, flickering, blazing light coming from one of underneath the construction buildings. It was really odd, as there was no chance that it was a construction worker at 2:30 a.m. in the middle of the night. Before we had time to register what was going on, we heard something that made our hearts stop for a moment. It was a shrill, frantic cry of a woman, coming from the same building. Judging by the sound of her voice, she was in excruciating pain. What happened next gives me nightmares to this day. We saw someone falling from the building, literally meters away from us, causing an earth-shattering thud. Sandra almost yelled in terror, but Katja was able to quickly grab her mouth to make the sound fade. Thinking on her feet, she grabbed us both by the arm and pulled us behind a half-constructed wall of another building, just to be sure that no one could see us. We stayed behind this wall for what seemed like forever. Suddenly, we saw someone wearing a bright yellow jacket exiting the building, with a gas cutter in his right hand and an amputated arm in the left. We couldn't see his face because the place was not well lit, and it was almost pitch black there. Honestly, considering the absolute horror that we were in, that was the last thing that would cross our minds. After another eternity of making sure that we were now safe, we made it back home, still trembling with fear. We called 911. The police came and investigated. After a few days, we learned that it was a homeless woman who was murdered brutally that night. Her arm was cut off with a gas lighter, and she was pushed out of the 5th story and left to bleed and die. However, to this day, after several failed attempts, investigators have no clue as to who the murderer was. Last summer, I went to a house party in the Gary Owen neighborhood of Limerick, here in Ireland. We were right in the middle of lockdown restrictions, and I know it was really stupid and selfish of me to go, but I was just so in need of a stress release. I'm a really social creature, and I need to spend time around people, like I was actually going mad being stuck inside all on my own. I do actually really regret going, but breaking the virus restrictions aren't the reason I wish I hadn't gone, because I saw one of the worst, most horrifying things I have ever seen in my life at that party, and it's something I don't think I'll ever get out of my head. So the party is going swimmingly for a few hours, and I'm occupied being the little social butterfly that I am. But then I walk into the kitchen to get another drink, and this big argument is unfolding between this couple that seemed to be based around allegations of infidelity. It was super intense and awkward being in there with them, so I just quietly grabbed my bottle of wine from the fridge and then head back to where I was gabbing away with some new friends. I didn't really think much of it. House parties can be weird like that after all. One room people are passed out. Another one had people dancing around, while some rooms host little arguments between couples that usually don't turn into something hideous. Only this one did. The guy in the argument storms out of the party, And then for a few hours everything is good vibes again. But then at some point later in the night, the guy comes back to the party. People know his face by this point, so they don't really have any reason not to let him in. And I am guessing he didn't give them any clues as to what he was about to do. Otherwise, they would have never let him back into the house. The guy then searches the house to find the girl he had been arguing with. I'm not actually sure if they were a couple. I just heard them arguing about sleeping around. When he finds her, he confronts her, starts screaming at her, then reaches into his jacket, takes out a bottle, and then appears to douse her with the contents. People thought he was just being a jerk and throwing vodka on her. The outrage partly stemming from the wasted alcohol, as well as the undue aggression. He then legs it from the room, while she's screaming. From the people I have spoken to about it, the ones that were in the room when it happened, they first thought her screaming was her being a bit melodramatic about having some drink chucked on her face. But then she took her hands away from her face, and it's covered in what looks like burns. It wasn't alcohol he had thrown onto her face that night. It was acid. Luckily, someone there was a chemistry graduate. They realized what was happening almost straight away, and then grabbed something from under the kitchen sink that would neutralize the acid. I don't know what it was exactly, but it was some other chemical that probably didn't do her much good either, but it definitely stopped the damage from being any worse than it was. I heard the poor girl had to have a skin graft from her leg though. Like even with the help she got, her injuries were absolutely horrific. The guy who did it went on the run for a bit too. Like the guard guy, what we call the police in Ireland, didn't manage to get cuffs on him for like a month, and we were all so relieved when they finally did. I can't imagine what kind of monster does something like that after an argument. To use actual acid to try to permanently disfigure someone's face. That takes a really special kind of evil, don't you think? Back in the late 70s, I was a little girl around 7 or 8 years old. I loved spending time out on my uncle's farm, as I found it to be a source of stability in my life. My mom couldn't sit still, as my grandma would say. We moved all the time, 12 times just in 1 year alone. My uncle worked a full-time job and had to run his farm. So when drifters would come by, he would offer a place to stay and good home cooking, courtesy of my aunt, in exchange for an extra helping hand around the farm. One Saturday after a long day of work, my uncle took one of these farmhands out for dinner to the local restaurant, which was also the bar, gas station, and market. He lived in a tiny village with the only other establishment being a church at that time. My uncle returned home without his farmhand. We'll call him Tom, moving forward, stating that he had stayed behind at the bar to hang out with the other patrons. Later that night, my cousin Rick came home and had decided to sleep on the couch in the living room, instead of risking waking my aunt and uncle as he tried to sneak to his bedroom. You see, Rick was only about 15 or 16, if I remember correctly, and had gotten home way past his curfew. He had only been laying down for about 30 minutes or so when the front door opened. It was Tom, and he was covered in blood. Now my cousin knew that Tom was a farmhand and could possibly have been butchering an animal, but he couldn't understand why he'd be doing that at this time. All he knew is that something told him to keep his eyes closed and pretend to be sleeping. So he did. Tom stood there for an unusually long amount of time just staring at him before he finally walked away. Rick could then hear what sounded like the washing machine start up, then the shower turning on. He recalls thinking the entire situation was odd, but did eventually manage to fall asleep. The next day started out like any other, until my aunt returned home from church. She had to deliver the terrible news to my uncle that his lifelong friends that owned the local restaurant, bar, market, etc. had been brutally hacked to death the night before with an axe. They were a husband and wife that had their home attached to their business. Upon hearing the news, my cousin Rick thought back to Tom coming in that night covered in blood. He took my aunt aside to tell her what he had witnessed and to see if maybe Tom would have been working that late. But of course, the answer was no. She called the sheriff's office, who came out right away. Luckily, some blood was left on the washing machine, and even though DNA evidence was nothing back then like it is today, they were still able to trace the blood to one of the victims. The thing that scares me the most about this is that it came out in court that Tom had stated to the sheriff that when he returned to my uncle's home that night, if anyone had been awake, he was going to kill them all, and now wishes that he had. You see, I was sleeping on the couch opposite of my cousin that night. My mom never let me spend the night again.